When I walked into the courtroom that morning, my mother laughed under her breath, and my father, he just shook his head. It wasn't the kind of laugh that fills a room. No, it was soft, clipped, like someone trying not to choke on bitterness. And the way my father's head moved, slow and heavy, it felt like a verdict long before the judge ever opened his mouth. The smell of disinfectant and old paper filled the air. My heels clicked against the tile, echoing louder than they should have. Every sound in that courtroom seemed magnified: the rustle of papers, the squeak of a leather chair, the shallow cough of a bailiff waiting for things to start. I remember thinking how strange it was that even in the middle of what was about to be the worst moment of my life, time didn't stop. It just kept dragging forward, steady and merciless. I took my seat at the defendant's table. The wood was cold. My hands trembled when I placed them on top, trying to keep them still. Across from me sat my par. Hence the two people who once called me their pride and joy. And now they couldn't even look at me. Before that day, before the courtroom and the whispers and the shame, life was quiet, ordinary even. I used to believe that ordinary meant safe. That was my mistake. I lived in a small town outside of Nashville, Tennessee, the kind of town where people still waved at passing cars, where the grocery clerk knew your name, and where news, especially bad news, spread faster than the morning paper. I worked as a paralegal at a small family law firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. I was good at it, organized, discreet, and patient. My coworkers used to tease me for being the calm in chaos. I'd laugh it off, not realizing how ironic that would sound later. My parents, Linda and Robert Sanders, ran a small home renovation business. They'd built everything they had from scratch: a marriage, a business, and a reputation that everyone in town respected. I used to think they were the definition of love. They argued, sure, but they always made up. My mom would roll her eyes, my dad would sigh, and then they'd laugh like kids again. I grew up watching that, believing in that, and then there was Ethan. Ethan Pierce was the kind of man small towns whispered about, not because of scandal, but because he was too charming for his own good. He came from a family with money, but he never acted like it. When we met, I was 26, working late one evening at the office, and he'd come in with his sister who needed legal advice. He smiled at me like he already knew me. I remember that vividly. That smile, calm, steady, warm enough to thaw every guarded part of me. We started seeing each other soon after. Coffee dates turned into dinners, dinners turned into weekends, and within a year he proposed. My parents were overjoyed. My mother cried when I showed her the ring, and my dad gave Ethan that long, appraising stare that fathers give to men they're about to trust with their daughters. Everything looked perfect. We got married in a small church on the outskirts of town. White roses, navy suits, a gospel choir that made the walls tremble. My father walked me down the aisle, and my mother couldn't stop smiling. I thought, this is what it means to be blessed. If only blessings stayed that simple. Ethan and I moved into a modest home about 20 minutes from my parents' place. He worked in real estate, said he wanted to build a future where I'd never have to worry about anything, and for the first 2 years he made good on that promise. We took weekend trips to the lake. We had dinners with my parents every Sunday. My mom adored him, called him the son she never had. My dad, a man who didn't give compliments easily, used to say, "That boy's got sense." It felt like we were all one big family. Then little things started changing. At first, it was small. Ethan would come home late, smelling faintly of whiskey. When I asked, he'd shrug and say he was orking. He started locking his phone, saying his clients expected discretion. I tried not to think too much of it. My father always said, "Don't go looking for trouble unless you're ready to find it." But one night, I caught Ethan standing in the kitchen, whispering into his phone. His back was to me, his voice low, soft the way he used to talk to me. When he saw me standing there, he froze. Then, without missing a beat, he smiled and said, "Hey babe, just work stuff." Something inside me went still, that stillness, that heavy, quiet kind. It's the sound of a heart starting to know the truth before the mind does. The next few months blurred into suspicion and guilt. I'd catch glimpses: lipstick on a shirt collar, credit card charges from places we'd never been. But each time, Ethan had an explanation ready, logical, calm, almost rehearsed. And I believed him. Because love makes you foolish and marriage makes you stubborn. Then, one evening, my parents invited us over for dinner. My Om made her famous pot roast, the kind that melted in your mouth, and my dad poured us all glasses of his favorite bourbon. The house was warm, loud, full of laughter. For a moment, I forgot all my doubts. Until halfway through dinner, my mom looked at Ethan and said casually, "So, when were you planning to tell her?" The room went quiet. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. "Tell me what?" I asked. Ethan's face drained of color. He looked at my mom, then at me, then back again. "Linda, I thought." "Oh, don't look at me like that," she said, her tone sharp. I thought she already knew. My dad's jaw tightened. "Linda," he warned, but she waved him off. "What?" I whispered. My mom sighed, exasperated, not regretful. "That the down payment on your house didn't come from his savings, sweetheart. It came from your father. From us." The air left the room. I stared at Ethan. "You said it was your inheritance." He swallowed hard. I didn't want you to feel like you owed them anything." My mom laughed. Bitterly. "Oh, please. He didn't want you to know he asked your father for help because he already maxed out his credit cards. Isn't that right, Ethan?" My dad didn't say a word, just stared down at his plate. That was the first time something cracked between us, me and Ethan, me and my parents, because from that night on, I realized everyone in that room had kept something from me, and once that trust broke, nothing ever felt whole again. Months later, that silence turned into resentment. Ethan grew distant. My parents started treating me like I was fragile, and in my attempts to keep everyone together, I began to unravel. What none of us knew not yet was that the next lie would destroy far more than a marriage. It would bring us all to that courtroom, where my mother would laugh under her breath and my father would shake his head. Because the truth, the one I refused to see, was sitting right under my nose the whole time, and when it finally came out, I'd learned that betrayal does. And always come from the person you sleep beside. Sometimes it comes from the people who raised you. After that dinner, things never went back to normal. I tried. I really did. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding, that Ethan had made a mistake, that my parents had meant well. But once a seed of doubt is planted, it grows fast, wrapping itself around every thought, every look, every silence. Ethan and I stopped talking as much. Our dinners got quieter, our mornings shorter. He'd pour his coffee, kiss me on the cheek, and be out the door before the sun fully rose. And every night, when I heard the sound of his car pulling back into the driveway, a knot of anxiety would twist in my stomach. Then one morning, as I was folding laundry, I found a piece of paper in his jacket pocket, a bank statement. It wasn't the numbers that caught my attention, it was the name. A joint account. Not in my name. In my mother's. I froze. It didn't make sense. Maybe it was a mistake, I thought. Maybe my mom had co-signed something, or helped him with a loan. But deep down, that same cold stillness returned, the same one I'd felt when he lied about the down payment. I tucked the paper into my sweater and drove, straight to my parents' house. My mother was in the garden, trimming her roses when I pulled up. She looked up, squinting against the sun. "Well, if it isn't the early bird," she said, brushing her hands on her apron. "Ethan not keeping you busy today?" I forced a smile. "Can we talk inside?" Her expression shifted just slightly enough for me to notice. "Sure." Inside, the smell of lemon cleaner filled the air, the same scent from my childhood, comforting and sharp all at once. She poured herself coffee, sat at the table and waited. I placed the paper down between us. "What's this?" She didn't even blink, just took a slow sip of her coffee. "Looks like a bank statement," she said. "In your name and Ethan's." "Why?" Finally, she looked at me, that cool, steady star that mothers have when they think their child's about to throw a tantrum. "Because your husband isn't as good with money as he likes to think he is. And because I wasn't about to let my daughter lose her house over his pride." Her tone was matter-of-fact, almost bored. "So you opened an account with him? Behind my back?" "Behind your back," she repeated like she was testing the words. "Sweetheart, I didn't go sneaking around. I helped him. For you, that's not helping, Mom, that's deceit." Her lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You sound like a lawyer." I wanted to scream, but my voice came out small. "You should have told me, and you should have noticed he was drowning," she snapped, her tone suddenly sharp. "Do you even know how much he owes? How much of that fancy car he drives is actually his? He came to me, Jessica. grabbed the paper, and left. But that conversation, that moment, it marked the beginning of the end. Ethan came home that night acting like nothing was wrong. I waited until he was out of the shower, towel slung around his waist, before I showed him the paper. "Why do you have a joint account with my mother?" He froze, then sighed, running a hand through his wet hair. "She told you. I found it. Jessica, answer me." His eyes softened, that same gentle look he used when he wanted to calm me down. "She offered to help, okay? I didn't ask her to. She said your dad's been setting aside money for years, and that if I ever needed a little boost for the business, I could use some, so you took it. I borrowed it. With her name on the account?" He hesitated. "She said it would look cleaner that way for taxes." Something in his tone, the slight tremor, the way he wouldn't meet my eyes, told me he was lying. I turned away, my throat tightening. "Do you hear yourself? Do you know how humiliating this is for me? My mother has more control over my marriage than I do." He reached out, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Jess, please, don't." I stepped back. "You lied to me again." He didn't follow, didn't argue, just stood there, silent. That silence said everything I needed to know. After that, the distance between us turned into a canyon. I stopped trusting his explanations, and he stopped giving them. The late nights became later, the work calls became longer, and my mother, she became almost smug. She'd call to check in, always with that thin layer of condescension beneath her words. "Don't worry, honey. Men make mistakes. At least Ethan knows when to ask for help. Help." That word started to taste bitter. One Sunday, after weeks of avoiding family dinners, I finally showed up. My father greeted me at the door, tired eyes behind his glasses. "You all right, Pumpkin?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "Just tired." He gave me a small smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "Your mother means—" "Well," he said softly. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But as the night went on, watching her hover over Ethan, laughing at his jokes, pouring him another glass of wine before he even asked, something inside me broke. I realized she didn't just help him. She liked it. She liked being needed. Liked the control, liked watching me squirm. The following week, I did something I'd never done before. I went through Ethan's phone. I waited until he fell asleep on the couch, his head tilted back, the TV flickering blue light across his face. My hands were shaking as I picked up the phone, but I didn't stop. I told myself I needed the truth, no matter how ugly. It didn't take long to find it. Messages, dozens of them. Between him and my mother, they weren't romantic, not exactly, but they were intimate, too intimate. "You're doing so well, Ethan. Don't let her make you feel small. Thank you for today, Linda. I couldn't have done it without you. You don't need to thank me. You deserve someone who believes in you." The last one made my stomach twist. I sat there for almost an hour, reading every word. My heart didn't just hurt, it hardened. The next morning, I packed a small bag and drove to a hotel on the other side of town. I didn't tell Ethan where I went. I didn't answer my parents' calls. But 2 days later, I received an email from my father. It was short. Just one line. "Jess, we need to talk. It's about your mother. Come home." When I walked into my parents' house that afternoon, my dad was sitting alone at the kitchen table. His hands were folded, his expression hollow. "Where's Mom?" I asked. He looked up, tired and broken. "Out. Probably with him." The silence that followed was thick, unbearable. Then he said, almost in a whisper, "I found out they've been moving money from our business account." My breath caught. "What?" He nodded. "Transfers. Thousands. Going into that account you found." The world tilted. My father, the man who'd built everything, with his bare hands, was trembling. "I trusted her," he said quietly. "And she's been stealing from me. From us." I sat down across from him, my mind spinning. Why would she? He cut me off. "Because she thinks he's her second chance." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" My father's voice cracked. "She's in love with him, Jess." That was the moment I realized the courtroom I'd eventually walk into wouldn't be about love, or money, or even betrayal. It would be about family, and what happens when the people who raised you destroy everything you believed about loyalty. And in that courtroom, when I saw my mother laugh under her breath and my father shake his head, I understood why, because by then, none of us were innocent anymore. I didn't believe it at first. even with the proof sitting right there, the transfers, the messages, my father's broken voice. I still wanted to believe there was some explanation, some misunderstanding. My mother couldn't be in love with my husband. That wasn't Jew. Seemed betrayal, it was insanity. But then again, insanity has a way of wearing normal clothes. That night, I sat in my car for hours, staring at the house I grew up in. The curtains were drawn, lights glowing faintly through the fabric. I could see her silhouette moving from room to room, calm, graceful, unbothered. I waited until Ethan's car pulled up to the curb. He didn't even park in the driveway, just slipped out quietly, like a man who'd done this before. I watched him knock twice. My mother opened the door immediately, and then she smiled. That smile, the one she used to give me when I was little. When I'd come home from school with scraped knees or good grades, it wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to him. When I finally drove away, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left a shell behind. The next morning, I called my father. "Dad," I said softly, "I saw them." He was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he exhaled. "I know." His voice sounded older, weaker. "I hired someone last week, a private investigator. She followed your mother." My stomach turned. "And?" He hesitated. "They've been meeting for months, sometimes at hotels, sometimes at that old rental property your mother manages." He paused, then added, "She transferred almost $70,000 to his name and took out another $30,000 from our joint account last month." I felt the world tilt again. "Dad, we have to do something." "I already have," he said quietly. I froze the accounts. I called a lawyer. Then he said something that I'll never forget. "I'm filing for divorce. My parents had been married for 38 years. I couldn't imagine them apart. Couldn't imagine Thanksgiving without my mother's laughter or my father's stubborn silence." But that morning, hearing him say those words, I realized something. Sometimes the people we thought were unbreakable are the ones shattering right in front of us. When he hung up, I sat air in my kitchen, clutching the phone, wondering how everything had turned so quickly. Just a year ago, we were planning barbecues, celebrating anniversaries, pretending life was good. Now my husband was sleeping with my mother, and my father was filing for divorce. Over the next few weeks, our small town became an echo chamber of whispers. People noticed when Ethan stopped coming home. They noticed when my mother stopped wearing her wedding ring. I avoided everyone. I stopped going to work. My boss tried to call, but I let it ring. I couldn't stand the thought of showing up in court, typing affidavits for other people's divorces while mine and my parents' lives were falling apart. Then one morning, I got a call from an unknown number. "Jessica Sanders?" the voice asked. "Yes, this is Detective Larkin with the Metro Police Department. We need you to come in regarding a financial complaint filed by Robert Sanders." My chest tightened. "Complaint?" "Yes, ma'am. It involves your mother, Linda Sanders, and an individual named Ethan Pierce." I closed my eyes. Of course it did. When I arrived at the station, the detective handed me a thick folder. Inside were bank statements, wire transfers, and signatures. My mother's handwriting, Ethan's initials. They'd moved money not just from the renovation business, but from a trust account my father had set up for retirement, and for me, a trust worth over $200,000. They'd cleaned out almost all of it. "Your father said the transfers started about 9 months ago," the detective said. "Does that line up with when your husband's business began having issues?" I nodded numbly. "Yes. We believe your husband persuaded your mother to invest in his company, but he never registered the funds. It looks like he used them for personal expenses." My heart pounded. "Can my mother be charged?" The detective hesitated. "If she participated knowingly, yes. Your father is pressing charges for fraud and embezzlement." The trial began 2 months later. By then, the damage was done. Ethan had vanished. My mother's reputation and my father's business were both in ruins. And me? I was stuck somewhere in the middle, torn between two people who'd both shaped me, both betrayed me, and both wanted me to take their side. The morning of the hearing, I sat in my car outside the courthouse for nearly 20 minutes. The radio played softly some country song about heartbreak and forgiveness, and I thought about how my life used to sound like that too. Simple, predictable, kind. When I finally walked in, that's when it happened, that quiet, cutting moment that I would never forget. My mother laughed under her breath, and my father shook his head. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't nerves. It was a statement. My mother, sitting beside her lawyer in a crisp navy suit, looked more like a woman going to brunch than someone facing criminal charges. Her hair was perfect, her lipstick red, her nails polished. My father, on the other hand, low. Okayed wrecked. Pale, sunken. His hands fidgeted with his glasses as he stared at the floor. When he glanced up and saw me, something in his eyes broke. He mouthed, "I'm sorry," and my mother just smirked. The testimony lasted hours. The courtroom smelled of paper, perfume, and stale coffee. I listened as the lawyers read through documents, tracing every lie back to the day it started. The hardest part was hearing my mother defend herself. "I didn't steal from him," she said, her voice steady. "It was our money. I simply used it." "Used it for what?" the prosecutor asked. "For someone who deserved a chance." She glanced toward Ethan's empty chair, her chin held high. "He was good to me," she continued. "He listened. He cared." "Robert hasn't done that in years." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. I couldn't breathe. I felt the air leave my chest, like someone had punched the wind out of me. She said it so simply, so unapologetically, as if loving my husband was an act of grace, not destruct. After the hearing adjourned for the day, I stepped outside for air. The sky was gray, heavy with rain. I leaned against the railing, my hands trembling. Then I heard my father behind me, "Jess." I turned. He looked tired, but there was something else, a flicker of gratitude, maybe relief. "I didn't want you to see this," he said quietly. "I needed to," I whispered. "I needed to know I wasn't crazy." He nodded slowly. "You were never crazy, sweetheart. Just trusting." I swallowed hard. "What happens now?" He sighed. "If the judge rules in my favor, she'll face charges. But honestly, I don't even care about the money anymore. What do you care about?" He looked out toward the parking lot, where the rain had started falling in thin, steady lines. "Peace. That's all I want now, peace." I watched him walk away, his shoulders heavy with years of love and betrayal, and that's when it hit me. Peace isn't something you find. It's something you rebuild, piece by piece, after everything around you has burned down. That night, I went home to an empty house. The photos on the wall, me and Ethan at our wedding, my parents holding hands, all felt like ghosts. I took them down one by one, and for the first time I didn't cry, because sometimes letting go isn't weakness, it's survival. But I didn't know yet that the worst was still to come, because a week later, I got a letter in the mail from Ethan. The envelope was plain. No return address, no perfume, no handwriting I recognized, just my name, Jessica Sanders, typed neatly across the front. I remember holding it for a long time before opening it. There's something about mail after betrayal. It feels like a trap. I finally tore it open and unfolded a single sheet of paper. "Jess, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not hiding, just gone. You deserve to know the truth, even if it doesn't change anything. Your mother didn't seduce me. I went to her first. I told her things I shouldn't have about the debt, the loans, the business falling apart. She offered to help. I didn't realize what that would turn into, but after a while, it stopped being about the money. She said she loved me, and maybe part of me wanted to believe her. I know what I did to you is unforgivable. You didn't deserve any of this, but please believe me when I say it wasn't revenge, it wasn't hate. It was weakness. I'm sorry. Ethan." The letter trembled in my hands. Not because I still loved him, but because even now, even after everything, he managed to make it sound almost noble. I sat there in my kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd once planned our future, and realized something that made my stomach twist. He never once said he loved me. The trial continued without Ethan. He never showed up, and no one could find him. The court issued a warrant, but the prosecutor told us what we already suspected: he'd probably left the state, maybe even the country. The case shifted focus entirely onto my mother, watching her sit there, Cal, and collected, while her lawyer argued she was a victim of emotional manipulation, made me sick. Because the truth was, she wasn't manipulated, she chose it. I still remember the way she looked at me that final day in court, as if she were the one who'd been wronged. When the verdict was read, guilty of fraud, embezzlement, and aiding in financial misconduct, she didn't cry, she didn't plead, she just turned her head slightly toward me and smiled, faint and cold, as if to say, "You think you've won? My father, sitting beside his attorney, let out a breath that sounded like years of pain leaving his chest. When the judge spoke of sentencing, my mother laughed under her breath again, that same sound from the first day I walked in. It wasn't laughter, it was defiance. And my father just shook his head, whispering, "God help her." Afterward, life became strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, just empty. The town moved on faster than I expected. People whispered for a few weeks, then stopped. The gossip mill found new stories to chew on. My parents' company shut down, their old office sold to a younger contractor who probably never knew what had happened there. I tried to rebuild. I went back to work not at the law firm but at a nonprofit that handled financial recovery for women who'd been defrauded or manipulated. It felt fitting somehow to turn the worst parts of my story into something useful. But even then, healing wasn't linear. There were days I'd see a woman come into the office crying over a husband's betrayal, and something in me would crack all over again. There were nights I'd wake up from dreams of my mother's laughter echoing down courthouse halls. And sometimes when I visited my father, now living alone in a small apartment by the river, I'd see the same hollow look in his eyes. Like two survivors standing in the wreckage of a war no one else saw. One evening, about 6 months after the verdict, my father and I sat on his balcony, watching the sun go down. The air was cool, the sky painted in soft orange and pink. He poured us both a glass of sweet tea and said quietly, "You know, she called me last week." I looked up. "Mom?" He nodded. "From the facility. She'd been sentenced to 3 years in a minimum security prison. My father never visited. Neither did I. What did she say?" He took a sip of tea before answering. "She said she forgave me." I frowned. "Forgave you? For what? For not understanding her?" I laughed, though it came out bitter. "She's unbelievable." He looked at me for a long time. "You know what's strange? Even after everything she did, a part of me still misses her." I nodded slowly. "I think that's the hardest part, missing someone who broke you." He smiled sadly. "That's love, sweetheart. It doesn't stop when it should. It just changes shape." We sat there for a while listening to the cicadas hum. Then he said, "You remind me of her sometimes?" I turned toward him. "Is that supposed to comfort me?" He chuckled softly. "It should. You've got her strength, just not her pride. That's what'll save you." I didn't hear from my mother directly until the day she was released. She sent me a letter, handwritten this time, in the same cursive she used when I was a child, and she'd leave notes in my lunchbox. "Jess, I know you'll never forgive me. Maybe you shouldn't. But I hope you'll remember that I loved you, even if I didn't know how to show it. I got lost in what I thought I deserved. I thought I was helping you, helping him, helping myself. But all I did was destroy everything. Tell your father I don't expect his forgiveness. I just want peace. I hope someday you'll find yours too." "Mom." I read it 3 times. The first with anger, the second with disbelief, and the third with something closer to sorrow, because despite everything I could still hear her voice in those words, soft, proud, complicated. She didn't ask me to visit. She didn't ask for sympathy. Maybe she finally understood what she'd done. Or maybe she just didn't have the energy to lie anymore. Either way, I never wrote back. A year later, I sold the house Ethan and I had shared. The memories there were too loud. The kitchen where we laughed, the bedroom where I cried, it all felt haunted by choices I didn't make. I moved to a small apartment downtown, started walking to work, started cooking for one, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, life began to feel normal again. One evening, I stood by the window, watching people hurry along the street below strangers, all carrying invisible stories, and I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Ethan. Not even at my mother. Because anger keeps you tethered to the past, and I'd been dragging that anchor long enough. I whispered to the empty room, "I forgive you, not for them, but for me." A few months later, I got a call from a local news reporter. She was writing an article on white-collar crimes in small towns and wanted to include my family. Wise case. She asked if I wanted to comment. For a moment, I thought about saying no. But then I thought about all the women who stayed quiet, who never told their side, who let shame turn them invisible. So I said yes. When the article came out, it didn't sensationalize anything. It just told the truth, a story about love, greed, and the blurred lines between helping and hurting. At the end, there was a quote from me. "Sometimes betrayal doesn't destroy you. It reveals who you are without the people who lied to you." That line went more viral than I expected, but what mattered to me wasn't the attention. It was knowing that somewhere out there someone might read it and feel less alone. By the second anniversary of the trial, I'd stopped counting the days since Ethan left. I stopped checking the mail, hoping for closure. I stopped needing my mother's apology. I just lived. And one afternoon, as I walked by the courthouse, the same courthouse where it all fell apart, I looked through the glass doors, and for a fleeting second, I saw my reflection there. Older, wiser, standing taller than before, and I thought, this is where she laughed, and he shook his head. But I'm still standing, that was enough. I don't remember much about the drive home that night. The courthouse lights faded behind me, but the echoes lingered: the judge's gavel, the scrape of my mother's chair, the trembling sighs that didn't belong to anyone in particular but somehow belonged to all of us. By the time I reached the small apartment I'd been renting for a few months, my body felt like it had aged years. I hung my coat by the door, sat on the couch, and just stared at the framed photo of me and my parents from Thanksgiving 3 years ago. We were smiling a little forced, maybe, but still together. I remember that day. My mom made her famous pecan pie, and my dad carved the turkey like it was a tradition that meant something. And me? I was just happy to be home. I never imagined that 3 years later I'd be testifying against them. That night, I didn't cry. I thought I would, but the tears never came. Instead, I made tea chamomile, the same kind my mom used to make when I couldn't sleep as a kid, and sat in silence. The sound of the kettle reminded me of her laugh in the courtroom, that low, barely contained chuckle that made my skin crawl. It wasn't cruel, exactly. It was worse than cruel. It was disbelieving, like she couldn't wrap her head around the idea that her own daughter was standing on the other side of the truth. The next morning, I opened my blinds and let the light in. The city was waking up: joggers on the sidewalk, the sound of a garbage truck, the hum of a world that didn't know or care what had happened in that courtroom. It felt strange that life just goes on, no matter how much your own has unraveled. I went back to work the following week. I'm a paralegal, ironically enough. That's how I learned to spot inconsistencies, to question signatures, to trust documents more than words. My coworkers didn't ask questions. They knew something had happened. They'd seen the news articles, the whispers, but they respected the silence I wrapped around myself like armor. It wasn't until late one evening, when I was reviewing a client file, that my boss, Mr. Leland, walked over. He placed a cup of coffee beside me and said softly, "You know, most people never have the courage to stand up to family. It's the hardest kind of truth to tell." I looked at him, surprised. "You read the case?" He nodded. "Of course I did. You were brave, Ava." I didn't feel brave. I felt hollow. But his words stuck with me. Maybe bravery doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like survival, like walking away from the people who raised you, because staying would destroy what's left of you. 2 months passed before I saw my father again. He called out of nowhere, said he wanted to talk. His voice sounded tired, older than I remembered. We met at a diner halfway between my apartment and their home. When I walked in, he was already there, stirring sugar into his coffee. He looked up, eyes heavy but warm. "You look good," he said. "You too," I replied, though it wasn't true. His hair had grayed more, and there were deep lines around his mouth, the kind that come from years of holding in too much. We sat in silence for a while, just the hum of the old jukebox filling the space. Then he said quietly, "Your mother still won't talk to me. She says I chose you over her." "You didn't choose anyone, Dad. You just told the truth." He nodded slowly. "Maybe. But truth has a way of making people feel betrayed, even when it's what they needed to hear." He looked out the window, watching cars pass. "She's angry, Ava. But she'll come around one day. She always does eventually." I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew some wounds don't heal, they just stop bleeding. We talked for almost 2 hours that morning. Not about the case, not about what was lost, just life. He told me he'd started gardening again, said it helped calm his mind. I told him about a stray cat that had started sleeping on my porch. It was simple, and maybe that simplicity was what made it feel so human. When we hugged goodbye, he whispered, "I'm proud of you, kiddo." That was the first time I'd heard those words from him since everything fell apart. And it broke something inside me, but in a good way. The months that followed weren't easy, but they were honest. I learned how to live quietly again. I started going on walks in the morning, cooking for myself, even redecorating my apartment's soft yellow curtains, a small plant on the windowsill, fresh flowers every week. Little things that reminded me I could still build something new. Therapy helped too. My therapist, Dr. Lane, once said something that changed how I saw everything. "Ava, forgiveness isn't a gift for them. It's a release for you." I thought about that often, especially on night. When I replayed the sound of my mother's laughter in that courtroom, I realized I didn't need her to apologize. I didn't even need her to understand. I just needed to let go of the hope that she ever would. One Saturday afternoon, I found myself driving past my old neighborhood. I hadn't planned it. I was just running errands, and suddenly, there it was. The house I grew up in. The garden was overgrown, the mailbox rusted. But it still felt familiar. The wind smelled like jasmine, just like it did when I was 12 and used to sit on the porch swing with Mom, listening to cicadas in the summer heat. I parked across the street and sat there for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't go up to the door. I just watched the house, and in that stillness, I realized something. You can love people and still let them go. You can miss someone and still know you're better off without them. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it softened. It turned it into something I could carry without bitterness. The last letter I received from my mother came a few weeks later. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even kind. It simply said, "I don't understand how you could do this to us, but maybe one day I will." I folded it carefully and tucked it into a drawer, because that was enough. It wasn't closure, but it was something, an acknowledgement that, in her own way, she was trying to make sense of what had happened, and maybe that was the closest thing to peace we'd ever get. Now, a year later, I still walk past courthouses sometimes on my lunch breaks. I don't do it on purpose, it's just part of the city. But whenever I see people walking out, some relieved, some broken, I always pause. Because I know what it feels like to walk into that kind of room and realize that truth costs more than anyone ever tells you. But I also know what it feels like to walk out of it free, though not unscarred. The truth destroyed my family. But it also set me free from the lies that have destroyed me. And if I've learned anything, it's this. You can survive heartbreak, even when it comes from the people who raised you. You just have to keep walking, even when your legs shake, even when your heart breaks, you keep walking. Because peace doesn't find you all at once. It comes in fragments, a morning light through the blinds, the sound of a kettle, a small cat asleep on your porch. That's how healing happens. Quietly. It started small, a whisper at the grocery store, a polite silence at the church potluck. In a town like ours, news travels faster than forgiveness. And when the story involves the once picture-perfect Stevens family, everyone finds a way to say something without ever saying too much. My mother used to love the attention. She was the kind of woman people noticed, elegant, articulate, always ready with a casserole and a compliment. She ran every PTA event, chaired every fundraiser, and somehow made everyone else feel like they should try hard to be more like her. But that was before the courtroom, before the truth about the missing funds from the community charity came out, before people realized that the woman who'd hosted those gleaming luncheons had also been quietly moving money from donation accounts into her own business for safekeeping. I didn't expose her to hurt her. I did it because I had no choice. When I found the transfer receipts, months of small withdrawals she'd justified as reimbursements, I begged her to fix it quietly, to return it before anyone found out. She said I was overreacting. Then she said I was ungrateful. And finally she said I was disloyal. So when it all came out in court, and she looked at me with that mix of disbelief and rage, I knew she wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry she got caught. The public consequence came slow, like erosion. People stopped calling. The invitations disappeared. Even her bridge club, the one she'd run for 15 years, suddenly needed a brea. Dad told me she barely left the house, that she'd stopped going to the grocery store, started ordering everything online. When he'd try to talk to her about it, she'd snap. "They're all hypocrites, John. Every last one of them, like they've never made a mistake. But it wasn't just that she'd made a mistake, it was that she'd refused to own it. I thought the distance would make me feel vindicated, maybe even safe. But it didn't, because the more isolated she became, the more I realized shame is its own kind of prison. And even though she'd built it herself, part of me still wanted to unlock the door for her. The charity board called me a month after the verdict. They wanted me to return to help audit the books, make sure no other irregularities existed. I said yes, not out of obligation, but out of redemption, maybe. Walking back into that office was surreal. The same pale yellow walls, the same photos of smiling kids at fundraisers, except now, every smile felt heavier, like the air had changed. The board chair, Mrs. Whitfield, hugged me tightly when I arrived. "You did the right thing, Ava. I hope you know that sometimes the right thing doesn't feel right at all," I said quietly. She nodded. "It rarely does. But truth has to start somewhere." That moment stayed with me, because she was right, truth does have to start somewhere, even if it tears something sacred apart first. One Sunday I went back to church for the first time since the trial. I hesitated at the door, my palms sweating, unsure of how people would look at me. But when I walked in, a few heads turned, and then something unexpected happened. Mrs. O'Malley, my mother's oldest friend, stood up from her pew and walked straight toward me. I braced myself for whatever judgment was coming. Instead, she hugged me. "Your mama's hurting," she whispered. "But you did what she couldn't, you told the truth. And that takes strength." Her voice trembled. "She might not thank you now, but one day, you understand." I didn't know whether I believed that, but I nodded anyway. Later, during the service, I saw her sitting alone in the far corner of the church. My mother, dressed in a pale gray coat, her hair pinned neatly as always, but her eyes, usually sharp and commanding, looked small. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did and chose not to. But I saw her fingers twisting the hem of her handkerchief, her shoulders slumped just slightly forward, and for the first time I didn't see the woman who had laughed in that courtroom. I saw my mother, a flawed, frightened woman who had built her life around image and couldn't bear to live without it. And in that moment, my anger softened. Not into forgiveness, not yet, but into understanding. Dad called that evening. He said she'd gone straight home after service and sat on the porch for hours. She asked if you were there, he told me. "What did you say?" I told her yes, and that you didn't look away. I didn't know what to say, so I just whispered, "Thank you." The next few months brought small changes. Mom started volunteering again, not as a leader, not as the face of anything, just quietly, behind the scenes at a food pantry on the edge of town. It was the same pantry she used to write checks to and forget about. Now she was there every week, unloading boxes, packing lunches. Dad said it was humbling for her, that she didn't talk much, but when she did, her words were softer. He sent me a photo once, her, in a plain blue t-shirt, no makeup, handing a sandwich to a little boy. I saved it. Not because it erased what happened, but because it reminded me that people can still change, even after the truth burns everything they thought they were. One night, about 6 months after the trial, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Just my name, written in my mother's careful cursive. Inside was a single line. "I can't undo what I did, but I'm trying to be someone who wouldn't do it again. No signature, no apology. I didn't need one. Because for the first time I believed her. Word spread, as it always does. The town began to see her differently, not as the fallen queen of the neighborhood, but as someone trying to rebuild from the wreckage. Some people still gossiped, of course. Others offered polite smiles at the grocery store. But slowly, the silence around our family began to lift. And me? I found peace not in their forgiveness, but in my own. Because the truth didn't destroy my family forever, it just stripped away everything false, so that maybe someday something real could take its place. When I think back to that courtroom now, to my mother's laughter, my father's bowed head, the weight of every eye in that room, it doesn't sting like it used to, because I know that moment wasn't the end of us. It was the beginning of a harder, truer kind of love, one that doesn't need perfection to survive. Sometimes the only way to heal a family is to let it break. It's been nearly 2 years. Since that day in the courtroom, time has a strange way of softening things, not erasing them, but blurring the edges just enough that the memories no longer slice when you touch them. I still live in the same apartment. The yellow curtains have faded slightly, and the plant on my windowsill has grown tall enough to lean toward the sunlight, like it knows something I don't. I started a new job last spring, a non-profit that offers legal support to families who can't afford representation. When I walk through those doors every morning, the smell of old paper and burnt coffee feels like purpose. Like maybe all that pain led me somewhere I was meant to be. Sometimes when I'm reviewing a case file or talking to a client who's afraid of speaking the truth, I think of my mother, of how silence once felt like safety, and how I learned the hard way that it never is. Dad comes by on Sundays now. He brings groceries, insists on fixing things I didn't even know were broken. A leaky faucet, a woe. Bee-belay chair. He doesn't stay long, but we share coffee and stories, and when he leaves, I always feel a quiet kind of comfort. He and Mom live separately now, not divorced, just giving each other space. He says she's still volunteering, that she started teaching basic bookkeeping to some of the women at the food pantry. I don't ask how she's doing beyond that. It's not that I don't care, it's that I finally understand the difference between love and responsibility. Love means I still wish her peace. Responsibility means I don't go looking for her pain to fix it. There's a calm to my life now that I never thought I'd find again. On weekday evenings, I walk to the park a few blocks away. There's a bench near the pond where ducks gather at sunset, and I sit there with a thermos of tea, just watching. Sometimes I read. Sometimes I just listen to the wind in the trees, to the laughter of children in the distance, to my own heartbeat slowly returning to normal. The first time I caught myself laughing again, genuinely laughing, it startled me. It was at a friend's dinner party, when someone told a ridiculous story about locking themselves out in their pajamas. I laughed until I cried, and afterward, sitting in my car, I realized I hadn't thought about the trial, or the betrayal, or the shame, not even once that night. Healing doesn't announce itself, it just slips in quietly, in the middle of a laugh you didn't expect. Every once in a while I still dream of that courtroom. But now, in those dreams, the laughter I hear isn't cruel, it's distant, almost human. And my father's face isn't full of disappointment anymore. He's just tired, but proud. When I wake, I no longer feel the ache of guilt, just a quiet recognition that we all did what we thought we had to do. Even my mother. I've been writing more lately, journaling mostly. My therapist encouraged it, said it helps to give memory a place to rest. Sometimes I write about the past, other times I write letters. I'll never send. One of them begins like this. Mom, if you ever read this, I want you to know I still make your pecan pie every Thanksgiving. I don't make it as good as you did, but I try. The smell of caramelized sugar still reminds me of home, of the good parts, the warm kitchen, the way you used to hum while stirring. I think that's what I miss the most, the sound of you before the silence. I never finish those letters. Maybe I don't need to. Maybe just writing them is enough a way of saying I remember the love that existed before the lies. I've learned that healing isn't about erasing what happened. It's about integrating it, letting it live alongside the new parts of you without letting it define you. My mother's choices will always be part of my story, but they're not the whole story anymore, because now when people ask who I am, I don't start with what I survived. I start with who I've become. A few weeks ago, I ran into Mrs. Whitfield again, the charity board chair, who hugged me that day. She told me they were hosting a new fundraiser and asked if I'd consider speaking. My first instinct was to decline. The idea of standing in front of that community again still made my stomach twist. But then I thought about all the women who might be sitting there, silently carrying their own truths, afraid to break the image that keeps them trapped. So I said yes. The night of the event, the hall was warm and full of low chatter. I stood at the podium, hands trembling, heart steady. I told them the truth, not about what my mother did, but about what I learned from it. Sometimes, I said, the people we love the most are the ones who teach us how dangerous silence can be. But if you can speak up, if you can stand in the middle of everything falling apart and still tell the truth, you'll find that the world doesn't end. It just changes shape. When I finished, the room was quiet, not the heavy silence of judgment, but the stillness of understanding. And somewhere in the back, I thought I saw a familiar face, a woman with her hair pinned neatly, her eyes glistening under the light. I blinked, and she was gone. But for a moment, I let myself believe it was her. and that maybe, in some small way, we were both healing separately, but together. Later that night, walking home under the soft hum of streetlights, I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't waiting for closure. I was free, and freedom, I learned, doesn't come from the courtroom or the verdict, or even from forgiveness. It comes from finally understanding that what broke you doesn't have to define what you build next. I unlocked my door, set my keys on the table, and glanced once more at that old photo of us, me, Mom, and Dad, smiling on Thanksgiving. For the first time, I didn't look away, because even though everything changed, that picture still mattered. It was proof that love existed once, and that's enough for me now. You know, I used to think that love alone could keep a family together, that if you just held on hard enough, prayed hard enough, the cracks would seal themselves with time. But life doesn't work that way. Sometimes the cracks are there to let the truth breathe, because truth, no matter how ugly, is the only thing that ever sets us free. My mother's lies didn't just ruin her life. They forced me to find my own voice, to stop being the quiet girl who kept the peace at the dinner table, and become the woman who wasn't afraid to say, "This isn't right." And maybe that's what growing up really is. Realizing that the people we put on pedestals are just people, flawed, frightened, trying their best in the wrong ways. It doesn't excuse them, but it does make them human. And once you see that, you stop carrying the weight of trying to fix them. You just wish them peace from a distance and walk toward your own. If you're listening to this tonight, and your heart feels heavy with someone else's mistakes, remember this, you are allowed to let go. You are allowed to stop trying to be the glue for people who keep choosing to break. You can love someone and still step away. You can forgive them in silence and still never let them back into your storm. That doesn't make you cold, it makes you free, because healing isn't loud. It doesn't come with fireworks or grand apologies. It comes quietly, in the moments you stop checking if they've changed, in the mornings you wake up without that ache in your chest, in the laughter that escapes your lips before you realize you're no longer pretending. That's when you'll know you made it. You survived what tried to silence you, and you did it with grace. So if tonight you find yourself sitting in the dark, wondering if you'll ever feel whole again, remember this, my friend. Some things don't break to destroy us. Some things break so we can finally see the light coming through. Good night. Take care of that heart of yours. And if you're holding on to something that hurts, maybe tonight's the night you let it go.